Protests in Guinea turned deadly. In spite of a clampdown, the West African nation's anti-government protests and violent clashes with security forces continue. Guineans are frustrated with military leaders overseeing a promised return to democratic rule. Will the country see that return to democracy, or will more blood be lost? I'm Andrea Sankian. Today's newsmaker is Guinea. A year ago, fuel price hikes in Guinea triggered a major protest against the military government in Conakry. The June demonstrations were the first, but certainly not the last, and more unrest has since followed. This month alone, 7 people were killed and over 30 people injured in protests. The army was deployed to quell planned demonstrations in the capital last week. It was the latest clampdown as anger mounts against juntas that have seized power in coups d'etats across West and Central Africa since 2020. Frustrations are growing over the slow pace of a planned return to constitutional rule. Ahead of the protests in Guinea earlier this month, the organizers released this statement.
These demonstrations aim to ask the CNRD and the transitional government for the release of the hostages and the rapid return to the constitutional order, in accordance with the commitments made on September 5, 2021, by the President of the Transition, Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya. Let no one shrink from intimidation and repression, the ultimate weapons of dictators, which will quickly show their limits. It is at this price only that we will liberate our country and prevent any attempt to confiscate our democracy and our fundamental freedoms.
Well, in Guinea, opposition political parties initially welcomed the September 2021 coup that ousted long-serving President Alpha Conde. But relations with junta leader Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya turned sour after main opposition parties rejected a 3-year transition to elections approved by the interim parliament last May. Doumbouya's government then banned all public demonstrations in response and has since cracked down on the street protests that followed. International rights groups like the United Nations and African Union have condemned the move. After the Burkina Faso, Mali, Sudan, and Guinea coups d'etats, the AU suspended those countries from the organization.
The Commission is ready to support these member states to return to constitutional order. The idea is that democracy must take root, must be consolidated, and must be promoted and protected.
Now, since June of last year, at least 24 people have been killed and dozens arrested, including high-profile activists and opposition parties. But it is perhaps ordinary Guineans left to suffer the most, like Conakry resident Mariam Diallo, who lost her brother. Fearing the anti-government demonstrations, he stayed at home only to be shot dead in front of the family home, she says, by police.
Around 5 p.m., I went to the house of some neighbors who had a death in their family. I left him at home with my children. As soon as I arrived at the neighbor's place, I was told that the police had shot a young person. I imagined many things because I had left my little brother at home. It was only when we got to the hospital that I realized it was him. I will never forgive those who killed him.
So as Guineans deal with daily insecurity, what is happening to the return to civilian rule in Guinea, as well as other Western and Central African nations? Well, joining me now to debate that are, from Oslo, E Yaw Tchie. He's a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. From Dakar, Fabien Offner. He is senior researcher at West and Central Africa Amnesty. And from Paris, Pierre, Elie de Rohan, a journalist at Africa Intelligence. Thanks all so much for being with us. Andrew, I'll start with you. Tell us what has happened in the year and a half since the military takeover that's got Guinea to this point. Was it inevitable?
Well, thank you very much for having me first. There have been several steps that have taken place over the last year and a half to move the state, as it were, and the challenges and the problems that it's had to a more democratic process. Now, that hasn't been fulfilled in many respects and many aspects. And what you see here, what you have seen in the last few days, has been a rise of protests, largely because of challenges that have ignited, partly because the transitional agreement or transitional process hasn't taken place, and what was expected from people, and particularly the opposition, hasn't been delivered on. And so you see that the protests have increased. There's been demonstrations that have gone violent. I believe over 7 people have been killed. Several in the 20s have also been injured during the protests as well. And what we are seeing is a crackdown from the military against the civilian aspects or civilian components who want the transition or who want this agreement to be put in place and for things to move to a democratic process.
Right.
Well.
Are you surprised that it's gotten to this point? Did you expect the military to fulfill the transition as promised?
I expected it because I think largely we see this as a pattern and a trend that is taking place, particularly across the continent. Not only in Sudan, obviously you guys have been covering that, but again in Mali and other places as well, where you do see military heavy or coups come in, and actually what you have is these military leaders or generals who say they're going to deliver on these things, but actually in actual fact they're not able to deliver on the aspects that they say they're going to. And I think also this is a challenging problem for not just West Africa, but the whole of the continent, partly because we have these leaders who are not willing to.
Unfortunately, it seems we're having some problems with Andrew's connection. But let me turn to Fabien then. It is disturbing. Each country, of course, has its own context and circumstances, but we are seeing similar stories play out across the continent, from West Africa all the way over to East Africa and Sudan. But Fabien, what are your sources telling you about what is actually happening on the ground in Guinea right now?
Basically, it's a huge disappointment on a human rights point of view, because we have to remember that almost 2 years ago, when the military, the CNRD, came at power and overthrew Alpha Conde, it was mainly in the name of justice. The head of state, Mamadi Doumbouya, has been saying this several times on TV, on media, and this was in the name of justice. And the Charter of the Transition made it clear that all the rights were going to be respected, and that this was one of the main objectives of the transitions. But now that we're almost 2 years after the coup, we just see that the situation is almost the same that when Alpha Conde was at power, meaning there are bans on demonstration, there are crackdown on every people who try to gather to demonstrate against the constitutional order. So basically, the situation is quite the same. I will not say it's really a surprise, because unfortunately, in our country, but also in Guinea, when you see the history in Guinea, there has been a lot of military power, and the last one before Alpha Conde was Moussa Dadis Camara, and we remember that when Dadis was at power, it ended up with the massacre of the 28th of September 2009.
Yeah. Pierre, let me turn to you. When the military took over in Guinea, many Guineans were not exactly disappointed. In fact, many of them did celebrate. Do you think they've since changed their mind, or is this chaos that we're seeing today still a better alternative to what they were suffering under Alpha Conde?
Yeah, so thank you for having me here. I'll start by saying that actually, yes, when Alpha Conde fell, a significant a thing to consider at the time was that there was an absence of really significant pro-Conde protests. So there was a sense that, at least in the capital, the population was rather happy with his departure. Now what we're witnessing is it's quite a change of tides, and from several actors in the Guinean society. We've seen it in recent weeks. There's been significant tensions in the military. We've seen this even more recently with the press. The press been on strike a couple of days ago, blaming the government for restricting internet access, notably. And now we're even seeing it, Fabien just mentioned the 28th September 2009 massacre, which was a significant initiative that the transition government committed to implement. And now the lawyers who are in charge of defending the victims of this trial, they're actually going on strike, blaming the government for not paying their salaries. So you could clearly see that public opinion is switching.
Pierre, quickly, will we see or are we seeing another Sudan scenario here where first the military simply kind of cements its rule and refuses to leave, and then second, infighting within the military breaking out?
Well, I think one needs to be cautious with this comparison. I mean, in the case of Sudan, you clearly could identify these two rival actors, Amity and Burhan. You could really feel the tension. There is indeed a tension in the Guinean military. It's been, it's clearly been seen with the dismissal of the head of the military army a couple of days ago. Yet at the same time, there's still a lot of opacity. It's less clear at the moment who really is pulling the strings within this bloc. But yes, infighting in the military is not a scenario to be excluded, definitely.
Right. Andrew, let me ask you, I mean, opacity is the key word, I think, there. Do we really know what is going on inside the military in Guinea right now and the people potentially waiting in the wings to take over transitional power, how strong they are, what the alternatives really are for Guinea?
Well, I don't think, just to answer your last part of the question, I don't think there are real alternatives at the moment. I mean, even if you were to look at Sudan or other cases, you still need to have the military aligned to this. So even if you do have a transitional or military, a civilian government in place, you still need to have the military in line, because if not, you have the risk of leaping back into a coup. I from the outside, I would say not everybody knows what is going on inside. And what I do suspect is there are parts where some aspects of the military are breaking down. There's disagreements, as previous speakers have mentioned, between the different factions within the military, but also I think also across the whole entire state itself. I think what is going to be key here is the role that neighboring states like Senegal will play in trying to push or nudge the military to meet the deadlines, but also holds those parties accountable. And that is, I think, an important thing, because while the AU and others will try and play a role, there is no real guarantor to this process.
Okay.
And so until you have that in place, then it becomes very difficult to move the process forward.
Clarify then why you cite specifically Senegal. And I mean, what about the AU? Yes, banning military leaders from the organization is one thing, but does something more constructive need to be done, can be done, given sometimes the AU doesn't like to intervene in other countries' internal politics too deeply?
Yes, I mean, I think that there is a role for the AU to play. There's also definitely a role for ECOWAS to play here. That's the regional REC, or the regional body in this case, and it should be playing more of a role. I think that the challenge that you have with the AU is it's sort of says, well, look, this is about subsidiarity. So in this case, it's waiting for ECOWAS to lead, and we're not sure where ECOWAS is. I know ECOWAS obviously has deployed efforts and whatnot, but they have, I think, for the large part, have stalled. And so what I would like to have seen is more engagement from ECOWAS, more engagement with the AU supporting ECOWAS, but also, again, maybe you then have Senegal who leads the way, mediates. Now, the reason why I mention Senegal is because in that region, and that's not just obviously the entire West Africa, but that coastal area, Senegal is seen as the key player here. And that is important, because if you don't have that key player in other parts of West Africa, you would have Nigeria or Ghana or whatnot. Here, you need to see Senegal playing a more constructive role, I would argue, to try and push and nudge people to meet those deadlines, but also to negotiate about what the future in the transitional period or process looks like. And that, to me, is still unclear.
Okay, Fabien, I will come right back to you, but I have to go to Pierre quickly. I'm just reading your facial expressions. I'm not sure you're completely convinced, but I may be misreading you about whether Senegal should be a clear player or a lead player here, and what role ECOWAS and the AU should actually be playing, if any.
Well, I think that was a fair point. I mean, Senegal is, as this has been said, is definitely a big player in the region, and it has diplomatic weight. Yet, on the other hand, it is dealing with a crisis itself. I mean, right now there are wider speculations about the current president, Macky Sall, going for a third term. So you could expect that this country is going to be very busy with domestic issues over the coming weeks and months.
And that going for a third term was actually what ignited this crisis in Guinea with Alpha Conde trying to change the constitution. Interesting there. Let me come back to Fabien, because as you know, Transparency International's 2021 Corruption Index actually ranked Guinea 150 out of 180 countries, which was actually down 13 places from 2020. How bad is the corruption now in Guinea, and how much is it holding back any transition back to democracy?
That's a good question. I think it's not only about Guinea. It's corruption is a worldwide issue, and in West Africa, it's not only about Guinea, but Guinea has been particularly implying, the last regime have been implying big corruption scandals, mainly in the mines sector. There has been all this issue with the Simandou project. Guinea is one of the worldwide main producer of iron ore. So this has always been an issue in Guinea today, but also yesterday, and it will also be the case in the next year. I think the question of the mandate is quite different, but what is sure is that when a regime came at power of Guinea, it needs money, and it mainly comes from the mine and from the bauxite, and this is also why the current regime has been negotiating again for the exploitation of the Simandou iron ore issue. But we can also see that corruption, of course, has significant consequences of human rights, and mainly economic human rights. And we have seen that in the last 10 years, Guinea has been struggling to give power to the people in the city, people like electricity, and this is in return can have consequences of the stability of the regime, because we've seen in the last month demonstration in Haute Guinea, which is the core of the current power, Malinke people, and the current power is mainly composed of Malinke people. And even in this region, there have been violent demonstrations against the power. So corruption is an issue, but if the money is not used for people in Guinea and to develop the socio-economical rights, that's going to be also a problem for the regime.
Right. Andrew, let me get your take on that. I mean, especially with the corruption index, because it was a horrible drop, 13 places, before the 2021 coup. Has it gotten any better since the military took over? I mean, will we see a better result in the next Transparency International Corruption Index for Guinea?
I think that's difficult to say. Look, I think with all countries across the continent, they all have the challenge of corruption, and I think it's. I think.
But is Guinea's
what
drop in that index and the year before the coup, is it not slightly more significant than the other corruption issues that the neighboring countries are dealing with?
I think it's a relative point. I mean, look, I am originally from Ghana, and Ghana has corruption issues, and that is something that is, I think, one could argue embedded in the system. And so I think it's relative in terms of, the types of, I'm not saying that the assessment was wrong, but I'm saying in terms of where and the access to that the reporting has been able to verify. I think it is a concern, it is a worry, but like I said, because of the situation, and it's a situation where it's quite unique and fragile in terms of obviously where we are. I think it's something that we have to take with a little bit of pinch of salt. I'm not saying we should ignore it, but let's see how things evolve over time, because there is always going to be some instability, some transitional period, challenges here, whatnot, and some of that is also obviously captured in that as well. Okay. So I think it's unfair during this period to sort of say, okay, it's a hard and fast sort of direction of where things are going.
Pierre, let me ask you, I mean, there's also some economic leverage that Guinea has. While it is a very poor country, its bauxite reserves are the world's largest. I mean, half of China's bauxite comes from Guinea, which is used to make aluminum for manufacturing. I mean, that's immeasurably huge. Has that been a blessing or a curse for Guinea? And how is it actually playing out now in what is supposed to be a transition back to democracy?
Yeah, well, I mean, right now it has. I think it's really hard to. It would be impossible that it has been a blessing. As you said, it has a. I think it's around 25% of the world's bauxite reserve. And so this, of course, will imply on paper a great financial reward, but it's not what we're seeing. I mean, you can see that there are all these foreign companies, whether Chinese or Russian or even American, who are on Guinean soil exploiting bauxite. Yet, as we've mentioned, I mean, the populations is not getting better off of it. One of the reasons for this is that, and this is a widespread problem in Africa, is that the primary material is rarely transformed on site. I mean, what matters is not quite the bauxite, but it's what you get out of it, the aluminum and then the aluminium. And yet refineries are yet to be developed on Guinean soil. There is only a few at the moment, and the government is trying to get more to be built. But so far, there's not significant developments in sight.
Right. In fact, I read that they are insisting on it, that they won't actually issue these contracts right now unless they can promise that the value add will stay in Guinea. Why is it not working out?
Well, I think their interlocutors are playing hardball. I mean, there's an interesting case, which is the Guinea's relationship with Rusal, which is a large Russian company that has actually a refinery in Guinea. Well, there was before Mamadi President Doumbouya came to power, there was a deal with Rusal, and Rusal had to build a second refinery. Yet this has not been delivered. President Doumbouya, once he came to power, he asked Rusal and the Russian diplomacy to build this second refinery. He even set a deadline for it to be built a couple of months ago. Yet right now, we did not see any significant progress on this issue, at least publicly.
Okay. I'll tell you what, we're down to our last few minutes. Fabien, I'll start with you and then give Andrew some final words. I mean, if we do look at the wider region, both West, Central, and Sudan, technically in East Africa, we have seen this wave of military coups d'etats in Mali, Guinea-Bissau, Burkina Faso, Sudan again, and attempts, actually, in various other countries. Each one has different circumstances, but as I said before, there are a lot of similarities. Is this a permanent cycle of military takeovers, or can it be broken?
Of course, it's difficult to say. As you said, the contexts are different. You know, in Mali, Burkina, there is an armed conflict, which is not the case in Guinea. You also add some French military bases in Mali and Burkina, which is not the case in Guinea. And some of the main people at the head of state in Guinea are also said to be French. So the situation is quite different. But I think if we have to take the case of Guinea, there are some really specific things to Guinea, which is in the last 60 years, Guinea has only known, authoritarian regime. And the country has not succeeded in changing the cycle, even when people were democratically elected, like Alpha Conde. Even Alpha Conde didn't succeed in this because he also wanted to stay at power. And at the same time, the fact that other countries that were considered as models of democracy, like Senegal, are also having issue with terms of mandate, like Ivory Coast. And when you have also an ECOWAS institution that is led by people like the president of Togo, that has been at power for 20 years, Mr. Ouattara in Côte d'Ivoire, that has also stayed in power, everything is being a little bit lower down in the region. And with this situation, the countries that have problems and military regime would most likely be able to stay longer at power because the other country and the international pressure is it's not enough.
Okay, Andrew?
I think it's a problem, I would argue, not across the various regions that you mentioned, but particularly in Francophone Africa. And I think that is indicative of, I would argue, the way in which they were run before independence up until now, the meddling of those states. And I go back to France's role and how that has been used to control, but also add to the challenges as well. But also, I think, as you said, the key issue for me is you have these constitutional changes and adjustments or transitional agreements that are in place. You need to support them long term. And so it's not just about saying, well, okay, this is agreement, the parties will hold, who are the guarantors, what are the necessary steps need to be taken, who is held in account over those periods of time. And I think that's where, unfortunately, the ECOWAS and the EU, but also the wider continent has struggled. It's holding these people account.
Andrew, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.